Both George W. Bush and Barack Obama have declared that Islam is a religion of peace. Anjem Chowdhury begs to differ.
You can't say that Islam is a religion of peace, because Islam does not mean peace. Islam means Islam submission. So the Muslim is the one who submits. You know, there's a place for violence in Islam. There's a place for jihad in Islam.
Chowdhury is the leader of Islam for UK, a group recently banned in Britain under the country's counter-terrorism laws. He wants Islamic Sharia law to rule the United Kingdom and is working to make that dream a reality. He's seen here converting a 10-year-old British boy to Islam. Islamic radicals in the United States are usually pretty savvy. They wear suits and ties. They speak, at least publicly, in moderate tones. But here in London, it's often a different story. Anjem Chowdhury has praised the 9/11 hijackers and called for the execution of Pope Benedict. Chowdhury told CBN News his group is a non-violent political and ideological movement that resides in the UK under a covenant of security. Yet he openly praises violent jihad.
The Quran is full of, jihad is the most talked about duty in the Quran after Tawheed, belief. Nothing else is mentioned more than the topic of fighting.
Several former members of Chowdhury's group have been arrested on terrorism charges.
A very significant number of former al-Muhajirun people were involved in terrorist plots against this country. A number of people have actually gone to Afghanistan, joined the Taliban, and died fighting for the Taliban.
Chowdhury refuses to condemn acts of terror, including 9/11 and the July 7, 2005 London bombings, which killed 52 people.
What were your thoughts on the 7/7 bombings? Did you condemn them? Did you support them?
For the people who carried it out, it was legitimate. If you look at the will of Muhammad Siddiq Khan and Shajat Tanveer, they will justify it, and they will bring many verses from the Quran and many statements to say that that's the Islamic argument. And it's a difficult Islamic argument to refute, and there are many scholars who support that argument as well.
Chowdhury says his group is merely following core Islamic teachings. He says Islam is much more than a religion.
This particular belief is more than just a religion. It's not just a spiritual belief. It is in fact an ideology which you believe in and you struggle for and you're willing even to die for, because you believe in that. That is your whole life.
He seems to relish being called Great Britain's most hated man, pledging to continue his rallies, calling for the overthrow of the British system. Eric Stakelbeck, CBN News, London.
Eric is with us now. And Eric, how does Chowdhury's opinions, or how do his opinions differ from what would be considered the more moderate Muslim?
Well, Pat, one word: honesty. Anjem Chowdhury tells you exactly what he thinks, exactly what he feels. He wants Islamic Sharia law. He supports jihad, and he doesn't like Christians and Jews. And he'll tell you that to your face, Pat. It's a lot different than here in the U.S. You know, I've interviewed so many Muslim leaders, supposedly moderate Muslim leaders here in the U.S., who tell me one thing on camera, but behind the scenes, when they're talking to fellow Muslims, they say quite another thing. It's the old Yasser Arafat rule, Pat. Say one thing to a Western audience, another thing to a Muslim audience. I think our viewers should consider this interview with Anjem Chowdhury an education. He is telling you exactly what they really believe, and we need to prepare for it.
How do you think George Bush and our current president got so snookered? Maybe our president isn't snookered. Maybe he's a crypto-Muslim. I don't know. What do you think?
You know, Pat, it's tough to say. I think honestly, there's just an ignorance about Islam. If you look back to the Cold War, you look back to the 1980s, Ronald Reagan was a guy who devoured everything he could get his hands on about communism, Marxism, Stalinism, the Soviet Union. He knew the enemy. I think our political leaders today, Pat, on both sides of the aisle are completely ignorant about Islam. We had a Democratic leader just 3 years ago who didn't know the difference between Shia and Sunni. And this was a guy sitting on an Intel committee, Pat. So there's ignorance across the board. And the reality here, Pat, let's face it, it's difficult to accept. It's not a pleasant reality that Islam it has a violent streak. It's much easier to sugarcoat it and say, hey, Islam is a religion of peace. We can reason with these people. No. I sat down with Anjem Chowdhury for over an hour there in London, Pat, and I'll tell you, you can't reason with him. He's not going to budge from this belief, and that belief is jihad.
What do you think about political correctness? Have the American people been so seduced by political correctness that they refuse it? We won't even mention Islam now in official proclamations.
Political correctness, Pat, could end up being the death of us. I think political correctness right now is killing Europe. The reluctance, once again, to identify not only the enemy, but what the enemy believes. This is what they believe. And, Pat, as Chowdhury said, they're getting this from the Quran. They're getting it from the Hadith. I wish it wasn't so, but it is. And it's been in there for 1,500 years, and to them, this is unchanging. It can't be changed. What we need is some Muslims. We can't do it. Some Muslims have to step up, look at the Quran, and say, hey, we have to bring this up to date to the 21st century. It's not the 7th century anymore. We need to bring it into the modern day. We need to strike these verses about jihad and try to translate in a way that it doesn't apply to the present day. That's a very, very tall order, Pat. As you know, that's what we need. I don't know that we'll get it.
Eric, I don't think we will either, but it looks like this violent confrontation is coming up all around the world, and there's no escaping. We've just got to be strong and fight these things where we can. But Eric Stakelbeck, great work. Keep it up. We appreciate you, brother.
Thank you, Pat.
According to research, in order for a culture to maintain itself for more than 25 years, there must be a fertility rate of 2.11 children per family. With anything less, the culture will decline. Historically, no culture has ever reversed a 1.9 fertility rate. A rate of 1.3, impossible to reverse, because it would take 80 to 100 years to correct itself. And there is no economic model that can sustain a culture during that time. In other words, if two sets of parents each have one child, there are half as many children as parents. If those children have one child, then there are 1/4 as many grandchildren as grandparents. If only 1 million babies are born in 2006, it's hard to have 2 million adults enter the workforce in 2026. As the population shrinks, so does the culture. As of 2007, the fertility rate in France was 1.8, England 1.6, Greece 1.3, Germany 1.3, Italy 1.2, Spain 1.1. Across the entire European Union of 31 countries, the fertility is a mere 1.38. Historical research tells us these numbers are impossible to reverse. In a matter of years, Europe as we know it will cease to exist. Yet the population of Europe is not declining. Why? Immigration. Islamic immigration. Of all population growth in Europe since 1990, 90% has been Islamic immigration. France, 1.8 children per family. Muslims, 8.1. In southern France, traditionally one of the most populated church regions in the world, there are now more mosques than churches. 30% of children ages 20 and younger are Islamic. In the larger cities such as Nice, Marseille, and Paris, that number has grown to 45%. By 2027, 1 in 5 Frenchmen will be Muslim. In just 39 years, France will be an Islamic republic. In the last 30 years, the Muslim population of Great Britain rose from 82,000 to 2.5 million, a 30-fold increase. There are over 1,000 mosques, many of them former churches. In the Netherlands, 50% of all newborns are Muslim, and in only 15 years, half of the population of the Netherlands will be Muslim. In Russia, there are over 23 million Muslims. That's 1 out of 5 Russians. 40% of the entire Russian army will be Islamic in just a few short years. Currently in Belgium, 25% of the population and 50% of all newborns are Muslim. The government of Belgium has stated 1/3 of all European children will be born to Muslim families by 2025, just 17 years away. The German government, the first to talk about this publicly, recently released a statement saying, "The fall in the German population can no longer be stopped. Its downward spiral is no longer reversible. It will be a Muslim state by the year 2050. Muammar al-Gaddafi of Libya said, "There are signs that Allah will grant victory to Islam in Europe, without swords, without guns, without conquest. We don't need terrorists. We don't need homicide bombers. The 50+ million Muslims in Europe will turn it into a Muslim continent within a few decades." There are currently 52 million Muslims in Europe. The German government said that number is expected to double in the next 20 years to 104 million. Closer to home, the numbers tell a similar story. Right now, Canada's fertility rate is 1.6, nearly a full point below what is required to sustain a culture. And Islam is now the fastest growing religion. Between 2001 and 2006, Canada's population increased by 1.6 million, 1.2 of those immigration. In the United States, the current fertility rate of American citizens is 1.6. With the influx of the Latino nations, the rate increases to 2.11, the bare minimum required to sustain a culture. In 1970, there were 100,000 Muslims in America. Today, there are over 9 million. The world is changing. It's time to wake up. 3 years ago, a meeting of 24 Islamic organizations was held in Chicago. The transcripts of that meeting showed in detail their plans to evangelize America through journalism, politics, education, and more. They said, "We must prepare ourselves for the reality that in 30 years, there will be 50 million Muslims living in America. The world that we live in is not the world in which our children and grandchildren will live." The Catholic Church recently reported that Islam has just surpassed their membership numbers. Some studies show that at Islam's current rate of growth, in 5 to 7 years, it will be the dominant religion of the world. As believers, we call upon you to join the effort to share the gospel message with the changing world. This is a call to action.